Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us again this morning. I appreciate you taking the time again out of your schedules to take part in today's session. So today's webinar is the third and final in a series of webinars that we focused on Symantec's IT Management Suite 8.1. The goal here in this webinar is to provide you with best practices overview when planning your implementation of the Altiris Asset Management solution with the latest version of the platform. We'll explore planning of an asset management program, extending the resource model out, hardware and asset tracking tips, and I'll wrap it up with a demonstration on leveraging a vendor-based data import into the Symantec CMDB. I'll present an overview of asset management, how it works, and we'll take a look at how the solution is built. We're going to go into a little bit of depth on the structure around the solution, behind the solution, and the components that make up the asset management offering. We'll also look at different options available to you and some important details around the product that will help shape your decision on how to approach your asset management environment. So again, as in the previous webinars, I'd like to make this presentation as interactive as possible. I do welcome your input. We'll kick it off at the end of the demonstration portion for a Q&A session. All right, then let's get started. So again, for those of you who have visited my webinars before, I'd like to start off by introducing myself. My name is Paul Manfredi, and I'm a senior systems engineer here at Intuitive in the professional services group. I'm based out of Los Angeles, California, and cover accounts nationwide for Intuitive. I've been working with Altiris and now Symantec since late 2006, and started my IT career back in the late 90s. I'm a certified Altiris engineer and instructor, going back to the 6.0 version of the product. Again, my main area of focus is endpoint management with a specialization in the ITMS suite, and in particular asset management implementations. I must have completed upward of 35, maybe 40 asset-related implementations in enterprise customers across North America. A quick note on Intuitive. We're a national Symantec partner focused on Symantec's endpoint management and security stack. We have a very strong dedicated services group, great team of people, really enjoy working at the company. And one of the original Altiris partners, so going back to day one in the late 90s. Okay, today's agenda, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to go through an overview of asset management, a look at the CMDB, the pieces that make up the CMDB, as well as data classes, resource associations, you name it. We've got a lot of slides to get through, so I'm going to keep the pace a little bit quick. And again, please hold off your questions if you can till the end. Take note. If you have to drop off, I will be providing a link to the recording of this webinar. And if you have any questions, again, please reach out. So after the overview, we're going to look at the resource model, as I mentioned, how to extend out the resource model to facilitate and accommodate for what I call the real life scenario of asset management in the corporation. So the data classes, the data that makes sense and is important to your company, how to capture that into the database and make sense of it and make use of it. We're going to look at importing asset information. I'm going to spend a brief amount of time on that, and then we're going to hit the demo, as I mentioned, at the end of it. The next piece I'm going to look at is the holistic view software agnostic as far as how to build an asset management program. What you need to be thinking about, who you need to take into the project with you, identify stakeholders, build out requirements, ensure success, that sort of thing. And yes, it is going to be process heavy, because in asset management, we basically succeed or fail based on the processes we create. And we'll look at that. The next topic we'll hit is actually looking at the data, the assets that we bring in. So using AMS in production, both on the hardware asset, how to modify, how to edit a piece of hardware in the CMDB, and the important parts then around software asset management. So the focus there, not so much in the delivery aspect, but in the software license compliance model. We're going to take a good look at that. And then we're going to finish off our webinar today with an AMS demo, as I mentioned, on importing vendor data. We're going to do a scenario that's specific vendor data based on some purchase-related fields for hardware computer assets. All right, overview of the AMS platform. Let's get started here. So at a high level, Asset Management Suite helps your organization to take charge of IT asset management and to run IT essentially as a business. It's really the business component to the IT Management Suite platform, and it's fully integrated. So there's a good bridge between the technical aspect of it and the business aspect of it. So using IT Asset Management Suite, we can maintain accurate budgeting by accounting for assets from procurement to disposal. So we get the entire life cycle of that asset, and we can report on it at each of those phases of the life cycle. And we can provide current data to achieve more accurate financial decisions. We can also manage change throughout the process of growth, reduction, mergers, transfers. So in times of growth, we use asset management to streamline employee onboarding, for example. And in times of corporate contraction, it facilitates asset relocation. So it can adapt and assist in changes to the business. We can ensure compliance by carefully tracking and managing assets and data to prevent their disappearance. So avoid asset leakage, that sort of thing. By performing software vendor licensing audits, we can also avoid license oversubscription. We'll take a close look at that, because that's one of the that's probably one of the strongest ROI use cases to implement asset management in your environment. And again, we leverage asset management to align IT with the business, so thereby enabling IT to become more strategic and assist the business in reducing operational costs. So the overall value proposition of Asset Management Suite is that it maximizes existing IT investments by actively eliminating unnecessary costs, managing contracts, aligning service resources with ITIL standards, accurately measuring asset total cost of ownership, etc. So let's look at the main components that make up the Asset Management Suite offering. So we've got the CMDB solution, the Asset Management solution, the replacement to a barcode solution, which is now Barcode Essentials. This is a third-party product, a very good product that runs on the iOS platform that we'll take a look at, available in the App Store. Very straightforward to integrate into the SMP. Next, my old friend, the Data Connector. This is our vehicle to import and export and manipulate data in the CMDB. We'll take a good look at that. Inventory solution, we're all familiar with, collecting inventory off the Symantec management agents and forwarding it into the CMDB to help build that overall picture of the asset, to include the real-time or near real-time attributes that software and hardware inventory solution collects for us. And then finally, IT analytics, which is the reporting component that makes reporting and KPI metrics a lot easier for non-SQL savvy folks to generate and provide reporting on the data in the CMDB. And again, we're going to take a look at each of these in detail here in the following slides. So first off, CMDB solution. CMDB solution enables you to model configuration items, resources, and relationships between them in the Symantec Management Platform's existing CMDB. CMDB solution has the following features and uses. So it lets us define organizational resources in hierarchy. Organizational resources such as departments, cost centers, are used to mirror your own organization's structure and hierarchy. So CMDB solution hierarchy features child to parent relationships, those are used to specify standard settings throughout an organizational hierarchy. For example, a task is applied to a parent department that can be automatically pushed down to a child department. Setting up organizational resources should be the first thing you do when you implement the CMDB solution. So we can define and edit resources also. Resources such as assets and contracts are entered into the database using predefined templates called resource types. The predefined resource types should be used when possible. Predefined resource types leverage other resource types. They provide summary data on resources created, including associated reports. They include functionality not available in custom resource types. If none of the predefined resource types meet your needs, you can create new resource types from scratch. You can also specify default resource type values so that all resources based on a resource type are created with those predefined values. We use it to add data to the configuration management database. Importing is the easiest and most efficient method of entering data into the system. You can also enter data manually, and we'll take a look at both those methods a little later on. As you set up a resource management system, there is certain data that makes sense to enter before other data. For example, most resources rely on the availability of organizational data. So relating your assets back to your department, your cost center, a user, a manager, a stock room, those sorts of things. It can also be used to clean up and configure data management with ready-made configuration items, and we'll take a look at those also, the maintenance tasks associated with asset management. Several configuration tasks only need to be performed during the initial setup of your resource management system. They're not ongoing tasks. Some common CMDB solution configuration tasks include performing your inventory to asset data synchronization, setting up default computer ownership, setting the default computer location, merging duplicate computers, and identifying computers that are no longer in use. Again, we'll take a look at those a little bit later on in the presentation. We can create customized item actions and CMDB rules to manage, manipulate, and keep the data uniform. For example, the variations of manufacturer type, we can put that into a uniform type name. Those CMDB rules target a group of assets based on their type and properties, and then make changes to the asset properties. For example, another example of that is serial numbers, associated contracts, owners, and so on. Out-of-the-box configuration items address the most commonly required resource management policies. CMDB rules provide the flexibility to create custom policies for individual resource management needs. We can leverage the role and scope security model to configure security. If multiple users work with resources, then security must be configured. So CMDB solution includes predefined security roles. You can modify predefined security roles. We typically suggest you clone them and then work off of the cloned version of the baked-in security roles. You can also restrict or allow access to the resource types and data classes using these roles. Hierarchy features are also used to set and enforce security settings throughout the hierarchy if you have a hierarchy in place in your environment. So the next piece is the asset management solution itself. So when you install asset management solution, the following occurs. You get the asset management items that are added to the management console. Specifically, you'll see the manage configuration items menu, the software licensing menu, contracts, procurement, and if you install Barcode Essentials, then you'll have that barcode portal, which are also added to the console. Also, the asset management menu items are added. There's also a set of built-in console reports that are added to the console. And components required to manage Asset Management Suite's own product licenses are added to the SIM, which is the Symantec Installation Manager, where you manage your license counts. So the next piece is the Barcode Essentials tool. And Barcode Essentials provides you with a simpler, more accurate way of gathering and verifying asset information in the field. This solution integrates information directly into Asset Management Solution and CMDB Solution, so the data input errors, accounting irregularities, redundancies are eliminated. Barcode Essentials lets you speed up the asset data entry. Side note, a barcode system is significantly faster and more accurate than manual data entry systems. It also lets you track and audit assets. So assets that can't be automatically discovered throughout the network connections, non-managed assets, assets that don't have an agent running on them, projectors, LCDs in meeting rooms, some telephony equipment. I've seen folks barcode and manage completely non-IT assets using Barcode Essentials. So it's not only for IT assets. We can branch out as far as we like with what we manage as far as physical inventories go. The caveat there being, you'd need to conduct those physical inventories with Barcode Essentials to make that happen. So your asset data can be downloaded to the Barcode Essentials device that is taken to the asset location, and then you do your physical inventories, for example. New asset data can also be collected while in the field. Barcode Essentials makes it easy to synchronize the data with the enterprise application. So it's done over Wi-Fi with a direct, secured HTTPS connection back to the notification server using your Windows credentials, and you upload and synchronize that data to it. The Barcode Essentials system also makes the inventory in the field visible to the warehouse. So example, stockroom, regardless where the assets are located, as long as you've got connectivity back to the server. Your warehouse can prepare accurate replacements of orders using up-to-the-minute inventory and stock availability. So in larger environments with multiple stockrooms that are spread out geographically, this is a great advantage when the procurement is done centrally, because the asset manager has good visibility into the current stock of assets in each of the stockrooms, and once they hit those low threshold or reorder thresholds, we can automatically invoke an automation policy to send an email to advise them, or they can generate scheduled reports out of the console, that sort of thing. So a lot of visibility into the accurate count of items in stock. One last thing, Barcode Essentials also provides support for custom templates. We can do license management to a degree also with it. We can provide upload verification and conflict resolution in the Barcode Essentials portal. And console-based scanning can also be done, as well as the management and synchronization profiles. So we can build out different profiles. You know, if you have 2 locations, you can build a profile for each location, or different types of profiles based on the assets that they're managing. So you could have an IT asset management and a non-IT asset management profile in there, and the types of assets that they synchronize and track are separate. Okay, IT analytics. So IT analytics and the IT analytics asset management reporting packs are automatically installed as part of the asset management suite. IT analytics is a product that's included in ITMS 8.1. These components help you take advantage or full advantage of the data that resides within the CMDB by providing advanced data mining capabilities, multi-dimensional analysis of trends, historical information, and a good set of graphical reporting features. So at a high level, it enables you to build ad hoc, multi-dimensional asset reports without requiring, as I mentioned, any advanced knowledge of databases and SQL queries. So you basically use a drag and drop interface and a list of predefined data fields. So asset management users can build out these reports on the fly. These reports include functionality such as drilling down, drilling up, pivoting, applying active filters, those sorts of things. So we can also explore asset data using a variety of methods, including pivot tables, graphical dashboards, tabular reports, and key performance indicators. We can also seamlessly export those reports to a variety of formats. So we can export it to Excel, a Word document, a PDF for high-level folks, take pictures of it, TIFF, attach it to as an XML to another application, and as far as something as simple as a CSV. Okay, next up is Data Connector. Data Connector, like I mentioned, is the component of the semantic management platform that lets us transfer data between external data sources in the CMDB. Data Connector supports a wide variety of data formats, so OLADB, ODBC, LDAP, XML, CSV. There's a couple others. There's at least Excel format that I use quite a bit. So a lot of different formats to get the data, to be able to read the data from the data source. So the Data Connector solution enables us to, like I said, import and export resource data between that data source and the CMDB. It also lets us import resource filter membership information, including adding or removing the membership of resources from one or more resource filters. We can import organizational view and group memberships, export reports. We can manipulate data within the CMDB using Data Connector. So this ability lets us easily normalize and correct any errors in your data. So, for example, it lets you use Data Connector to normalize company names so data is inconsistent. Or if you made a mistake on a Data Connector rule, you can actually use Data Connector to correct the mistake you made. Next up is Inventory Solution. So Inventory Solution is part of CMS. We all know that, and we use it to bring in all those attributes that define that managed endpoint to us, both software and on the hardware level. We extend out the Inventory Solution to obtain inventory from those computers in the network, things like operating systems. Prepare that software license audit by providing that number of installed licenses of an application. So these are ways that we leverage inventory solution out of CMS and append it to our asset information or asset data, and we get that fuller picture of the endpoint to help answer less technical and more business type questions around things like counts, costs, licensing, compliance, all those sorts of things. So it also lets us determine which computers need to be replaced according to their age, capabilities, end of warranty, scheduled refresh date, those kinds of things. We can use inventory also to identify the types and amounts of personal data that's stored on computers. Prepare for operating system migrations by identifying the number of different operating systems that are installed, identifying computers that do or do not meet those minimum requirements for a new operating system. So, last week we talked about our Win 10 migrations. These are typically how I get those metrics, by leveraging not only the things we looked at last week, but the raw numbers that asset management comes out with. Number of this model, number of that model, along with the operating system and the RAM and the hardware pieces. So it's really the culmination of the two sets of data, being the asset and the inventory. And also, lastly here, we can also, using inventory, we can deny unauthorized applications from running on managed computers. So we can run blacklist software titles, that sort of thing. Okay, here's the overall picture of the data flows between the notification server, being the core, the heart of the asset management environment, and the different pieces that interact with it. So in a full-blown implementation of Asset Management Suite, we'd look for, we'd look for an email server. So we'd use that to send out notifications related to asset management processes. We'd need Active Directory data source if we wanted to use it as a source for users, groups, computers, sites, etc. So we'd leverage an Active Directory import and synchronization to keep the Altiris platform in sync with Active Directory. We use a SQL Server. So SQL Server, again, is where the Symantec and the IT Analytics databases will live. The notification server itself, so the notification server, NS, will house the main components of Asset Management Suite. So Asset Management Solution, CMDB Solution, Barcode Essentials, IT Analytics, Data Connector. So they'll all live. Solution, the front-end solution will live on the notification server, with the CMDB itself and the IT Analytics databases being on the SQL box. Barcode Essentials. So Barcode Essentials will need to be installed on the iOS devices that the technicians would use in the field. These devices, again, they essentially become hosts for barcode scanning, and those barcode scanning or those technicians would use those devices to record any hardware asset change and then synchronize it to the CMDB. Again, inventory solutions. So that managed endpoint will collect and send software and hardware inventories based on scheduled policies. So this information will be stored in the CMDB and appended to any asset information that already exists. So a lot of the times we set it up in a way that we leverage the vendor data files to create those initial records or stub records of those assets while they're still in the box, and then go ahead and logically, physically logically and physically receive them. So they're created as resources, and then once they're shipped out and configured and put on the network and an agent is installed on them, they will append that information to the existing resource. And we'll look at the mechanics behind that in a few slides coming up here, as far as how that merge happens between the asset and the inventory information. Next up is workflow server. So if you want to automate any part of the asset processes you develop, or use any of the built-in asset management workflows that are available with Workflow Solution, you'll need to set up a workflow server. This system is used to run workflows and to host the process manager web portal that enables you to manage the workflow processes. And finally, over here on the right is the asset manager. And the asset manager will be the person, I mean, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but as far as their interaction with the CMDB or the notification server goes, their primary goal is to extract data, to make those business decisions using the information that CMDB can provide them. Okay, let's take a look at the components that make up the CMDB resource model. So in Asset Management Suite, or AMS, the term asset generally follows the fixed asset term that is used in the accounting platforms. That is, a fixed asset is an item of value which is defined by the organization and has been purchased and will be used for an extended period. So that's kind of the accounting definition of what an asset is. Examples of assets that we can track in AMS are computers, primarily, phones, monitors, printers, furniture, office equipment. I mean, there's a multitude of built-in asset types, and if you don't find the asset type that you're looking for in there, you can easily create one. It's very, like I mentioned, it's very extensible as far as the platform goes. CMDB is essentially a palette, and we create what we need based on the requirements of the business. I mean, I've seen everything in there from fleet maintenance of vehicles and artwork, just all kinds of things. So an asset has an associated cost, such as a purchase price, installation cost, and maintenance costs. In addition, the value of the asset may depreciate over time and can receive favorable tax treatment. So while AMS is not a financial accounting system, you can associate these costs and depreciations to the asset, making it possible to track the total cost of ownership and the value of the asset for accounting purposes. So here's where we provide, or here's where the accounting folks become a major stakeholder in our services engagements, because we can provide that fixed asset depreciation and tie that back to, the PeopleSoft fixed asset platform, for example. Leveraging their same asset ID so they can write those assets off accordingly. Okay, what's a configuration item? The term configuration item, which is often abbreviated CI, is a more general term for an asset, and it's used when referring to any configuration management item in the database. So the ITIL version 2 defines it as a configuration item as any item which, under the control of configuration management and therefore subject to formal change control. V3 gives the configuration item examples of IT services, hardware, software, buildings, people, even formal documentation, such as process documentation, SLAs, that type of thing. In addition to fixed assets such as computers and printers, AMS also treats items such as contracts, software licenses, locations, even accounting codes as configuration items. What's a resource? So these are the definitions, the terminology we use when building out the CMDB. So there's a specific definition for a resource in Altiris Asset Management. So we refer to a resource as an item managed by the Symantec Management Platform, or SMP. So these items are specifically stored and tracked in our configuration management database according to our SMP's resource model. So assets such as computers, printers, office equipment, and configuration items such as companies, locations, contracts that we saw earlier, once they're in our CMDB, they're all called resources. There are other items that aren't assets or configuration items that are stored as resources also in our CMDB. Examples of these are computer files, site services, error codes, cryptography, algorithms. Many of the items used in the software management framework, like detection rules, command lines, even the status of an asset is considered a resource in the database. So here's a graphic of the relationships between asset, configuration item, and resource. So assets are the subset of configuration items, and configuration items are the subset of resources. All assets are considered configuration items, but not all configuration items are assets. And all configuration items are resources, but not all resources are configuration items. Sorry if that sounds confusing, but again, maybe going through it in the recording a couple of times will help drive that home. And I've got a couple other slides that help with this. So when referring to an item, you may want to use the term that is most appropriate and easily understood. So the idea behind this is when speaking to the different departments, you're speaking their language when you refer to it as an asset. So if you refer to, or if you're discussing, having a discussion with the accounting department about a computer, you might call it an asset. If you talk about the same computer with somebody in change management, you may refer to it as a configuration item. But if you go and see your SMP administrator, you'd call that computer a resource. So in all three conversations, you're talking about the same computer. You're just giving it a different adjective to describe it. Okay, let's look at the different elements which make up the CMDB resource model. So the resource model is a logical framework for organizing and storing resources and their attributes. Also, their associations to other resources in the CMDB. Elements that make up the resource model include resource types, the data classes associated with those resource types, the resource association types themselves, so how we associate two resources, the type of hierarchy between resources, the resources themselves, so at the highest level, the resource item, resource associations, and finally the resource manager. And we're going to go through each one of these in a little more depth in the following slides here. So let's start off with the resource types. So resource types are like templates. Data about a resource is added to the CMDB using a template that's called a resource type. The resource type determines what information is recorded about the resource. For example, if a resource's type is the computer resource type, then information like serial number, model, and manufacturer would be information that would be stored along with that resource type in the template. But if a resource type is a user resource type, for example, then it would make sense it wouldn't actually make sense to store things like serial number, model, or manufacturer. Instead, other information would be associated to it, such as full name, employee ID, telephone number, address, user's manager, user's department, those sorts of things. So resources and their attributes are stored in tables in the CMDB. The resource type controls the attributes that can be stored for a resource by maintaining a list of data classes and resource association types that are linked to the resource type. So if you think of the computer resource type, the template is then made up of those data classes and resource associations that are pertinent to the computer resource type. Next up is a data class. So you can visualize a data class as a table in the CMDB. Rows in the data class represent the resource, and the columns are the resource's attributes. For example, here in the slide, we have the basic inventory data class, which is called the AEX AC TCP/IP data class. And it contains columns such as MAC address, IP address, subnet mask, DHCP, and DNS servers. There are two types of data classes. We have the inventory data class and the event data classes. So an inventory data class describes a computer's attribute, such as the operating system it's running or the name of the computer. Rows in an inventory data class are replaced as new inventory is received via those inventory policies, so the collections of those inventories. So the other one is an event data class, and an event data class describes an occurrence, such as examples would include when a user logs into a computer or when a task is run. Rows in the event data class are appended as events are received. So you can expect multiple rows in event data classes as opposed to an inventory data class, which is replaced each time inventory is collected. Next up, we have resource association types. So resource association types are basically the relationship between two resource types. Like a resource type, the resource association type is like a template. It describes a parent and child resource types and gives a name to the relationship. In many cases, the name gives a clue to the two resource types being related. For example, the asset status resource association type describes the relationship between an asset resource type and a fixed asset status resource type. Also, resource association types help to maintain referential integrity in the CMDB. In the asset status example, this means that the status associated with an asset resource is not typed in, but it's rather picked from a list comprised of existing statuses. So a new status resource must be created before it can be picked from the list. So in this example, there's a predefined list of asset statuses. But when we configure the solution, we can always add statuses to it. For example, a couple that I typically put in are out for repair, end of lease, build-in process, those types of things that help get a more granular tracking of the asset between the main lifecycle phases. All right, next up, let's look at the resource type hierarchy. So resource types are linked in a hierarchical structure, much like the branches of a tree. Every resource type has a parent, which is known as its base resource type. The only exception to this is the resource type named resource that we see at the top. You could think of this as the root of the tree. So each resource type inherits the data classes and resource association types from its base or parent resource type. Additional data classes and resource association types are added that extend the kind of information that can be stored from the child resource types. For example, if we consider the network resource, computer, and virtual machine resource types that we see over here, this branch coming up from virtual machine, the data class and resource association types from network resources are inherited by computer. Additional basic inventory data classes like AEX AC identification, so basic inventory, AEX AC primary user, so the primary user of that computer, are inherited and then added to the computer type from the network resource. And then the data classes from network resources and those added by computer are then inherited by virtual machine. And finally, additional data classes which are specific to virtual machine, like AEX AC virtual machine and VM guest, are then added. So if you think about it, you have a base set of resource attributes on the network resource, and then computer inherits those, and then virtual machine inherits the sum of all of these. So if we trace it all the way back up to the resource base type, all of the resources are inherited down through the branch from resource to asset to network resource to computer, finally adding the sum of all of those attributes to the virtual machine asset type. Okay, next up is resources themselves. So if you think of a resource type as being a template, when you fill out the template with information and save it, it becomes a resource. Sometimes the term resource item is used also to distinguish it from the resource type itself. So while a resource type refers to a category of items, a resource refers to a specific item. So example, Bob's computer, the color printer in the sales office, a user named Jane, or the Acme contract are all examples of a specific resource item. When a resource is created, a row containing the resource's GUID is added to either the table reserved for resources of that same resource type. So when a resource is a partition resource, or the item table when the resource is a non-partitioned resource. Additionally, rows containing information about the resource are added to the data classes specified by the resource type. So rows for a particular resource can only be added to a data class if that data class is specified in the resource type itself. Next up is resource associations. So while the existing resource association type specifies the kind of relationship that can exist between two resource types, a resource association specifies the relationship between two resources. For example, Bob's computer has an asset status of retired. Jane in the sales department. Jane is part of the sales department, and the Acme contract is assigned to Ken, are all examples of a resource association between two resource items. When a resource association is created, a row is added to the resource association table in the CMDB, and that specifies the type of relationship, so the resource association type, and the GUIDs of the two resources, the parent and the child, that are being associated. A row can only be added to associate two resources if there's an appropriate resource association type created already. For example, an association between Bob's computer resource and the active resource can be entered because there is a resource association type named assets status that associates a computer resource type to a fixed asset status resource type. Sometimes a resource can have multiple resource associations of the same type. For example, Bob's computer might belong to several cost centers, each paying a portion of Bob's purchase cost. So we would split the cost center. It would essentially be a one-to-many resource association here. So we could, I mean, this example, it covers two. There's typically not more than two of them, but we could go one-to-many, as many as we need. I put up a graphic of a resource model. This is a resource model that I created with Visio at a customer engagement recently. And I just wanted to provide a graphical interpretation of what it looks like, what the finished product looks like. So I map out, if you look at the headers in blue, those are all our resource types. And then the orange is going to be the data class. And the green will be the attributes under that data class. And then the orange and the lighter orange and the beige are custom data classes that I've associated. So if you look at this one, for example, on the computer resource type, I've added a custom data class of legal hold status, and the attributes of those are here. Custom resource type here. So in this particular client, when a computer came back into stock and there was a legal hold status put on those assets, the hard disk was actually, the hard disk drive of the computer was actually separated from the chassis and created as a separate asset. And those hard disks are put on a legal hold status and kept for an indefinite period of time. So again, an example of building out specific resources and resource data classes to meet your business requirements. All these arrows you see here, each one of the arrows in black is a resource association. So this one here, I'm not sure if you can see it, but it says software purchases, and that's the association between a software license and a software purchase, for example. And we'll look at that a little bit later, that specific software licensing example a little bit later on. Okay, next up is the resource manager. So the resource manager is a great tool that is part of the Symantec Management Console's web page that displays much of the information contained in the CMDB for a given resource, along with tools to perform actions on the resource, but in a great graphical representation of the resource itself. So using the resource manager, you're able to view the resource associations and the data contained in the data classes for the resource being displayed. Resource associations are displayed at the bottom of the left pane, along with a link to show the resource association grid. So down here, it'll also show you a report listing of all resource associations that were given, where the given resource is either the parent or the child resource. So your relationships there, your resource associations are shown. Asset Management Solution adds another link to show the resource association diagram, which gives you a visual representation of those resource associations. Selecting summaries, this is also one of the first stops when using the resource manager in the asset management daily activities. So selecting summaries, resource summary is displayed, selecting information contained in the data classes for the resource. This display will have a different appearance depending on the type of resource being summarized. So to get a full listing of it here, I encourage you to open up the console if you are currently using CMS or have AMS implemented, and just open one up and do view inventory. The right pane will be divided into two. with one portion showing the data classes arranged in folders and the other portion showing the data in a tabular form. Only the data classes specified in the resource type will be shown, and in addition, only the data classes that contain data for the given resource will be shown. Data classes that don't contain any data for the given resource will be hidden. So just because you don't see it there doesn't mean it's not one of the data classes, it just means that it's empty. Okay, let's take a look at extending out the resource model to fit any custom needs that you may have. So as a component of Asset Management Suite, CMDB solution provides many predefined resource types which satisfies the requirements of many environments. CMDB solution also lets us define, as I earlier mentioned, the custom resource type, resource association types, and data classes. In many environments, the predefined resource types are sufficient, but you may have information about resource types that can't be stored in the existing data classes. So in this case, you can create new data classes to store the resource's custom attributes. And that's actually the use case we're going to leverage for the demo at the end of the presentation. So in a few environments, the predefined resource types are sufficient, but again, we may have the need to build those out. Custom resource types are created with that base resource type that we define, and will inherit the data classes and resource association types from those base resources. So if you create a base resource type, example for tablets, you may want to use either asset, or if it's a Windows-based tablet that's going to get an agent on it, you may want to just let the agent get installed and manage it as a computer asset type. And new data classes and resource association types will extend those definitions out for you. Okay, creating a custom data class. So as we saw earlier in the resource model discussion, data classes can be visualized as being a table in the CMDB, and editable data classes are those in which you can add or remove attributes or columns. New data classes will always be created as editable data classes and will also be inventory data classes. So while you want to create new data classes before you use them when defining a new resource type, new data classes can also be added to existing resource types. If the data that will be defined in a data class already exists in some other database and contains a column that uniquely identifies the resource, such as a resource name or GUID, you can create a virtual data class. Data classes are found in the console by selecting settings, all settings. Let's see, I don't have a graphic up on that, but they're in the folder under resource and data class settings, data classes, and we'll look at that again in more detail in the demo. So let's look at a couple of screenshots here on creating one. So here we're going to create one called color and genre. So to configure a new data class, we change the name from the default, which comes in as new editable data class. This is important because since the name of the database table that will be linked to the data class will be created from the name of the data class itself, and it'll have a prefix of INV_, followed by the data class name with spaces replaced with an underscore character. So, for example, this one is going to be called, once we save the changes on this one, it's going to be called, in the database, it's going to create a table called INV_color_and_genre. Let's see, for each attribute or column that will be defined in the data class, click Add New Attribute and enter the following. So we'd enter over here the name of that attribute, the description, the type. So the type loosely corresponds to the data type defined for the database column. In most cases, we use string. We've also used integer, decimal, Boolean, date, currency. It all depends on what the attribute is. So, example, end of warranty date, we would fix the type of attribute to date. We can set the maximum length, the display order that it'll be viewed at when we edit the asset. And again, once they're all defined, we have all our data classes attributes defined. Just go ahead and click Save Changes. Next up, creating a custom resource type. So resource types, again, are found in the console in the same area under resource and data class settings under resource types. So we'd click the resource type, then select the base resource type. The data classes and resource associations defined in the base resource type will automatically be inherited. We would click the Select a Resource link or the pencil icon to configure an associated report that will be offered in a drop-down menu in the CI Management Console view. You can also create a custom report and select it here when you pick Reports, Service and Asset Management, and then it'll be under a folder called General Asset Report. From the data class selection, we then add the data class to the defined resource type that we wanted. So let's look now at linking the custom resource type in the CI Management console. So you want to create a link to your custom resource types in the CI Management portal. This link allows us to create and edit resources of the type specified in our custom resource type. So to create this link in the CI Management portal, in the left pane, you would choose to create a folder. Actually, you'd right-click on that folder and select New Resource Type Link, and then you'd select the custom resource type and hit OK. So let's look at creating custom resource association types. So those are found again in the same general folder of resource and data class settings. To configure a resource association type, we change the name from the default of New Editable Association Type. This will then forward the resource association type name. That's the name when displaying the from or parent resource type to show the relationship to the to or child resource type. We'd add an appropriate description by clicking the words Add Description. Optionally, we could also enter a reverse display name. This name would be used when displaying the to or child resource to show the relationship to the from or parent resource type. Okay, continuing on that same line of the custom association types. So we then click on the Select a Resource Type link. We'd select the from or parent resource type and click on the Select a Resource Type link to select the to or child resource type over here. If the from and to types are the same resource type, which they can be, you can mark and allow association to itself. And we would typically use one like that where the resource types are the same for building out a location hierarchy. So, you know, first floor, second floor, third floor are child resource types to a parent of, you know, building A, for example. Next up, we'd enter a minimum cardinality. So the cardinality specifies the minimum number of relationships that must be established between the child and parent resources. In most cases here, we use either 0 for no minimum or 1 being a minimum of 1 relationship. We'd also enter the maximum cardinality, and there we can just, we use that to define the maximum number of relationships. So we're almost there. Next up, we would mark the resource types where the resource association can be created and select the mechanism style to create the resource association. If you mark the parent resource, when you edit the parent resource and forward resource association is displayed and can be created. If you mark the child resource, when you edit the child resource, the reverse resource association is displayed and can be created. In either case, it's the same resource association. It just lets you edit or establish that association when editing either the child or parent resources. Okay, let's go over the different ways now to edit an asset that can be imported into the CMDB. So discovering and importing network assets, there are a couple methods that we use to do that. The Symantec management platform provides essentially 2 automated discovery methods for importing assets that are in your network. Both these methods are found in the console under Actions Discover menu. And the first one is the Import Active Directory. So that'll import, discover, import, and enumerate in the CMDB assets collected via Active Directory. So if they exist as a computer item in Active Directory, we can bring those in. And we can also build an import based on domain membership and even wins if that is what you need for your environment. Again, we leverage other solutions here such as inventory solution and deployment even, which can automatically create new assets and gather information about those assets during their creation. So inventory solution, if a machine is discovered, inventory is collected on it for the first time, it will create the resource when it forwards that inventory for the first time to the CMDB. So let's take a closer look here at importing those assets via Active Directory imports. So in CMDB solution and Data Connector, we looked at using the features to import resources both from Active Directory. We can also leverage LDAP data sources as well as direct imports from Data Connector. We can create an LDAP connection in Data Connector to the schema, to the Active Directory schema, or other schema in your environment to bring in computer or any asset types. So you can configure these import rules in Active Directory import on the Active Directory import page, again, to import computer, users, print queues, subnets, any of those resources from Active Directory, and organize them into organizational groups that mirror the Active Directory OUs. So again, this page is found under Actions, Discover, Import Microsoft Active Directory. Discovery of assets. We can discover assets based on domain membership, again in the same neighborhood. We can skip through most of that. So let's take a look at importing via Data Connector. So again, just to reiterate, CMDB is the component in asset management. From a licensing perspective, will require a license, a separate license. If you're a CMS customer, you will require a license for a CMDB solution. Data Connector, on the other hand, is maintained as a component of SMP, and is a prerequisite for Asset Management Suite. But if you own Asset Management Suite, it won't require a separate license for Data Connector. It's part of it. CMDB solution adds several resource types, again, the data classes, resource association types, to the SMP, and allows you to create those others. Using CMDB rules, again, we normalize, correct any of those errors in the data. So CMDB solution adds two of those important tools. I don't have a graphic for this one, but so the resource association diagram that you can get to most easily from the resource manager page. And finally, it keeps track of those changes that are made to the resources via resource change history. Resource change history is a very useful tool in the resource manager that'll let us view any historical changes to the resource. So it'll iterate backward time-wise on any event. Example, the computer was added to its location changed, its owner changed, a cost center was added. Any of those types of changes are viewed in the resource change history report. So a very important piece to leverage if you're an asset manager. Data Connector, we went through this. I don't think we really need to hit it again. Maybe one thing worth noting here, if we didn't already, is the Data Connector lets us leverage it to import that organizational data. So at the outset of your implementation, the most important pieces are the foundational pieces of your data, your organizational data, like locations, cost centers, group information, before you bring in your assets to build out those organizational views to help you with things, to populate those organizational views like assets by location, users by cost center, things like that. So transferring resources using Data Connector, the two general steps behind that. So while you're more likely to import resources from an external data source into the CMDB, the procedure for exporting is actually quite similar. There are two general steps, creating that data source definition, and then using that definition to create a data transfer rule. So if you needed to export a group of assets via Data Connector, it can easily be done. Data Connector rules are also known as connector rules. We can use them to import, export those rules using the console. The Data Connector rules can be scheduled like policies, or you can create a task and run the data rule immediately. There's also a testing feature in the data rule that we'll look at in a few minutes. So switching gears here a little bit before we get to the demo, I wanted to go through the basic planning of an asset management program, some high-level topics that I wanted to cover, and essentially just a basic overview of the steps involved to a successful asset management program implementation. So first off, we want to gather those business requirements, conduct an assessment. So conduct stakeholder interviews with all of the key project players, gather their requirements for an asset management program that your implementation of asset will provide, identify the potential risks that may impact the project, like an unreliable data source or lack of internal project buy-in. Ensure you're able to translate the stakeholder requirements and that they map to specific data elements from the CMDB, which you'll be able to provide in the form of reports. So an example here could include end-of-lease reports to the finance team or a breakdown of taxes paid by state for taxation purposes. The general idea here is to provide the asset management value proposition to your internal teams. Next up, you'd want to conduct asset lifecycle workshop meetings and whiteboarding sessions with your stakeholders to bring out and develop the potential use cases in your environment. At the end of this phase, you should have your stakeholders' requirements documented and use cases documented, and conducted follow-up meetings with the stakeholders to review and obtain their final approval. So you want to make sure that you're aligned and level set properly with the business aspect of this before going into the next phase of design. So the next phase here would include creating your asset management environment design and documentation. You should document the end-to-end lifecycle management process workflows. Again, these steps should be reviewed with the stakeholders and would identify the step-by-step of any data sources needed and the different players and asset management touch points over the asset's lifecycle. So with all the lifecycle aspects covered, the team reviews complete. Again, stakeholder approval complete. That would round off this phase of your design. Again, in the essence of time here, I'm trying to condense this and keep it as high level as possible. I am oversimplifying it to a certain degree, and I apologize for that, but my clock tells me we're running short on time here. So next up would be your AMS testing and pilot deployment phase. So after your asset management strategy has been finalized and approved with your teams, the initial installation and configuration of asset management solutions should be conducted. The installation should be complete and include any and all custom data classes, resource types, and associations that were identified during the information gathering and design phases. Next, you'd pilot out a sample tracking use cases for both hardware and then software assets. For the hardware assets, this should include vendor and purchase-related information that's captured during the purchase asset phase through the physical reception of the asset. These attributes will then lay down the foundation for the inventory policies that will be collected after the asset's been deployed in the environment. For software assets, ensure you've harvested and imported all the historical software purchase information possible. This will enable you to map software purchases to your licensed software installs when you rationalize your software library. Then finalize any custom reporting requirements with your stakeholders. Remember, your reports are the output that the lines of business will use, and the accuracy of this data you provide is critical to the success of the asset management program. Review all of your custom resource model configurations to ensure they are accurate and that any scheduled data source imports are running correctly. I typically draft a data connector schedule when conducting the asset implementation. That schedule assists me with the timing of the data imports, which can be important in the event that there's a dependency on an earlier data element being present before running a subsequent import rule. An example of this scenario could be a vendor import of a weekly report of purchased computers that would need to run before a rule which assigns them to a specific stockroom could be completed. Okay, after the environment has been fully tested and any data source schedule conflicts resolved, the asset management platform will be ready for production. So a production swap or switch over would involve stopping any of your existing asset tracking methods and fully committing to your new processes. Your overall configuration walkthrough should include a series of exception reports that would enumerate any gaps in those processes. For example, a report of computer assets with a received asset status, but an unassigned stockroom. Next up, you review your internal documentation and update it where needed. Complete your internal staff mentoring and enablement sessions. you'd want to work closely with your asset management team at the early stages of the production phase to ensure their success. And finally, after any remaining issues are resolved, you would transfer ownership of the non-technical aspects of the platform to the asset management team. Okay, let's quick run through of using AMS in production. So assets can be manually created during any phase if they're not brought in, so one-offs, and they can be created or edited using the console here. You can, right-click on any computer asset and edit. You can right-click on the computer asset up here and do Create Computer. I've got a screenshot over here of the Barcode Essentials tool where we're in an asset with this barcode number of KS1001. So I can click on any of these fields here and edit them and then save the asset. License compliance, so editing software licensing and manipulating the software license piece. So software license compliance is essentially the representation of the licensable aspect of the application. And we use the software product as the pivotal point of that in the asset management suite. So it enables you to link or associate a software resource which houses all the details about a managed application, such as release, upgrade, conflicts, and supersession details, as well as rules for detecting installed software with a software license, thereby providing an effective method for managing software licensing compliance. Licensing compliance is computed by comparing the number of detected installations of an application as determined by the software resources detection rules with the number of available licenses for that application as determined by the software purchases and other license resources associated with the software license contract. So I've got a graphic of that representation here. So if you could picture the software product as the center point or the scale by which we measure software usage versus our software entitlements. And the fulcrum of this balance being license compliance, where we're essentially aiming for a 0, meaning our usage is equal to our entitlement. So we would input from the right side over here all of our software purchase information, and those purchases would support the license. And I have purchases in plural here because we can have multiple purchases supporting a single license. And that would populate the right-hand side of the balance. And coming from the left side would be our software usage. So that would be gathered primarily through software inventory collection policies. We could also manually add pieces or metrics into that based on, example, donated licenses and non-inventoried licenses. So perhaps a remote location that's consuming licenses that we're unable to inventory or don't have connectivity to, we can account for those here. And again, that would populate the left side. And then our license compliance reports, there are actually tasks in here which compute and bring out those license compliance reports. So in an effort to keep the asset data accurate and automate that uniformity where possible, there are several built-in asset maintenance tasks. We're going to do a real quick run through these tasks. So assigning ownership to the primary user. This one will essentially take a computer's ownership and use the primary user data class from inventory to call it the owner of the asset. So when we report on asset ownership, it is assigned to the primary user. And this is configurable. So if it doesn't work for our environment, we're able to, not use it or run it on its schedule if that does work for us. Cleaning ownership. So cleaning ownership essentially will remove any inventory data related to, I'm sorry, this is clean ownership. Clean ownership resolves conflicts between the ownership resources. So the asset user owners resource association for that asset with a user resource or department resource are assigned here and kept straightened out. So if there are two assignments of ownership, this schedule will clean those out, or should I say resolve them. Automatic merging of duplicate assets, duplicate computers, I should say. This one is specific to serial number. So this one, if we set this to run where it finds assets with a duplicate serial number, it will merge them into two assets. It'll take the asset with the most recent date, and what that'll do is it'll wipe out the resource change history of the older one. So I tend to leave this one unchecked and manage this process through either asset management processes or either with a combination actually of asset management processes and manual merging of duplicate computers. Duplicate users. So we may end up with duplicate users based from varying data sources. So I may bring in users based on Active Directory import as well as PeopleSoft HR imports, for example. So I may end up with duplicate users in my CMDB. So this automated task will take care of that for me. A more general resource merge rule, similar to the computer merge rule, but this one I can merge any resource type that's currently in the database. The next one is manually merging duplicate resources. So for this one, as I mentioned earlier, the resource merge tasks determine which resource and data classes to keep or discard based on the most recent date that these items were created or modified. If you want granular control over which resources and data classes are retained in a merge, you must perform the merge manually. And again, the same caveat applies that you will lose the resource change history on the older of the two assets. The next is the performing inventory cleanup. So this is the one that deletes inventory data from the asset management suite, inventory data classes, I should say, excuse me, but will retain the asset fields. So the point here is that it'll free up an inventory license, an inventory solution license for you. It'll recover that when this task runs. All right, the next one is performing inventory to asset synchronization. So what this task does is it synchronizes certain data classes, inventory data classes, and brings those over and merges them into the asset data classes, namely the serial number, the system number if we're using it, and manufacturer and model information. Next, we use this one a little bit less now because of the environment being so mobile, with more laptops in the environment. What this task did for us was it assigned resources to specific locations based on the subnet that was assigned to that location. So if you had a group of computers on subnet A and you associated subnet A to location 1, then any computer that would be part of subnet A would automatically be associated to location 1. Again, a little less used now because of our more mobile IT asset makeup. Okay, that is it for the slides. I'm going to switch real quick here and bring us over to the demo. I know we're running a little bit short on time. Again, if you have to drop, that's fine. I will send out the recording to the webinar if you'd like to view the demonstration a little bit later on at your convenience. So let's just frame up the use case here. So what we're going to do in this demo is we're going to look at importing vendor data using the data connector to accomplish that. So specifically, we're going to update computer assets with specific vendor attributes that we received from a vendor report that's associated to the purchase of those computers. So we'll start out by extending the resource model and creating a custom data class to accommodate for those specific attributes coming from the vendor. And then we'll associate that custom data class to a computer resource type. And we'll look at the mechanics behind actually using the data connector to map those data fields from the vendor source to the custom data class. Okay, so here's my management platform box, and I've gone ahead and created the custom data class already, and I've called it vendor order details, trying to keep it as generic as possible. So if we look at the use case behind this is if I go ahead and look at the computers right now, I see that for these computers, I don't currently have a data class. If I scroll through, I don't have a data class that will accommodate for the fields I need. So these are essentially the fields coming from the spreadsheet from the vendor. You know, things like the end of warranty date, when it was invoiced, the order date, the invoice number, the purchase order that was paid for it, the specific customer number that we used when we placed the order, those sorts of things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this data class and I'm going to associate it to the computer resource type. So when I go into one of my computer assets here, I'll have that new data class here, just like this one, which is also a custom data class. So let's go ahead and associate that custom data class now to our computer resource type. So again, in resource and data class settings, I've got my vendor order details data class. I'm going to go down to my computer resource type, which is here under asset types, IT, and then computer. And I'm going to, it's well hidden as you can see, I'm going to add that data class to it. So as a best practice, I build out a folder under each one of the data model subfolders here with an underscore custom, which just helps me easily find the data classes or whichever the resource items are that I'm looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and add vendor order details here, and then I'm going to save it out. And now I see it's here. So now if I go back to my computers, If I go over here back to my under my CI management console, and I look at one of the computers now and edit it from a resource perspective, I should find my vendor order details right here. So now I've got my customer number that I can populate, my PO, my vendor purchase ID, invoice number, and all the associated dates. So now if we fast forward a little bit here, to the asset manager or the report person can draft a report of assets with their end warranty date. So I could easily build out my refresh schedule for hardware, for example. So now that we've got that data class built, we're going to leverage data connector, which is again under settings, all settings, connector. We're going to leverage our data connector to map that data source, and I've done that here already, got a little head start. So I went ahead and mapped it to the specified spreadsheet, and then I defined the worksheet name, and I can view the data here. So here's my data with the fields that I'm going to be importing, and now I have my data source set. I can go ahead and create a rule for it. So once again, I've created the rule ahead of time in the essence of saving self some time here. So I've created a data import rule that uses my data source as its data source. The direction is importing, so I'm bringing it in. I can put a data filter on it, so I can say things like if column equals computer, if there's a column called asset type, for example. So I can narrow the focus down of the vendor report to a specific field. So now I want to assign the column mappings. So I want to make sure that for this particular one, I'm set to the computer resource type, because I'm going to be adding these specific fields to the computer type. I don't want to create any resources, but I could if this was, for example, a vendor folder that gave me the initial computer sales report, so I could create my stub records to receive against using this. But for this example, I just want to update existing computers that are already in the CMDB. So the only one I'm interested in is the vendor order details. So I can go ahead and decide which one I want. So I want to remove all of these, and they can stay there because they're empty. But we just want to clean it up a little bit. So I can also go ahead and browse out to the specific data class that I want, as long as I know where it is. This one being in my _custom folder. And any resource associations that already exist that I can map to my data source would happen here also. So for example, if the vendor source file said things like had a column that was charged to cost center, I could say in my associations, cost center ownership, and then assign the cost center to it. So I'll go ahead and save those changes here. And then I can use the test rule example. So I can run through a dry run of the data import before. So I see that I have 44 rows processed. It didn't actually create anything. I can go into more detail here by viewing the log. So I can look at rows with errors and rows without errors. I can take a look. You do have to sometimes reduce the size here. And let's see. So there was an error here, and this is the part that I didn't discuss, is the resource lookup key. So the resource lookup key is going to use a unique identifier found both in the data source as well as a unique identifier in the CMDB. And this is what it's going to use as its primary key to look up against to say this resource is that resource based on serial number. So what I'm going to go and do is assign the resource lookup key as service tag, because this is a Dell report, and we use service tag nomenclature for defining serial numbers. And let's go ahead and test that rule again. It should be a little more. Yeah. So we can go ahead and look at it from here, and we see that it's going to update this serial tag or service number. Is going to write these specific attributes to that resource. So our test looks pretty good. We can go ahead and close out from the test window and run the window. Run the rule, I should say. So it's running the rule. The rule is really quick. It's very fast. It writes it directly to the CMDB. And now if I go and look at the same computer, hopefully this is one of the ones that it actually wrote to. May not be. It is not. Let's go and look at one of the ones it probably did write to. Let's take a look at this one. So here's one of the machines that it actually wrote to. So again, it used the serial number as a unique key, and it automatically added all of the attributes based on the vendor order details. So now that data class for the machines that we had in our data source have populated dates. So we can see we bought this a few months back. It's coming due May of 2020. And again, the use case here is we can build out reports based on our end of warranty date. All right. So I will go ahead and open up the floor if anybody's got any questions for me. You can just go ahead and unmute, and if not, if you need any additional guidance, we are offering a complimentary assessment on your asset environment, and as well as helping you work through any process issues you may be having. So with that said, I'll open it up to comments. Okay, any questions for me at this point? If not, I think we will call it. Sorry I ran a little late. I appreciate your time once again. Thanks everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye-bye.